When you zoom out from 1933 America, you realize it was never just an American story. It was the template. The same four-stage mechanism, crisis, criminalization, forced exchange, revaluation, reappeared across different regimes, different decades, different ideologies. Once you know the pattern, you start seeing it in places most people only know from history class headlines. Take Germany. After World War I, the country lived through one of the worst hyperinflations in modern history. People carried wages home in wheelbarrows. Savings evaporated in months, the scars of that period never fully healed. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, they inherited a nation haunted by economic trauma and bound by the Treaty of Versailles, which demanded crushing reparations. That combination, reparations, humiliation, and depression, forms Stage 1, an economic and political crisis so severe that almost any drastic measure can be framed as necessary. Hitler's regime wanted one thing above all: rearmament, tanks, planes, weapons, infrastructure. All of that required funding, and foreign creditors were wary of lending to a regime openly preparing for war. So they turned inward, to their own citizens' wealth. Gold was the last independent store of value left in private hands. Step by step, the regime tightened control, restrictions, registration, then outright orders to surrender gold. Jews and political opponents were targeted most aggressively, but the direction of travel was the same for everyone. That's Stage 2 again. Ownership becomes suspicious, then dangerous, then effectively illegal. The state sets the exchange terms, often far below international market prices. You don't negotiate, you comply. That's Stage 3, a forced one-way trade where citizens hand over something real and receive political paper in return, Reichsmarks that are only as strong as the regime that prints them. By 1939, Germany had accumulated tens of tons of gold. That hoard didn't just sit idle. It helped finance rearmament and war spending, while ordinary citizens lost their only hedge against what would soon become war, destruction, and controlled prices. That's Stage 4. The state uses the captured metal to extend its power, while the currency, and the lives tied to it, become expendable. Now jump to Britain, a democracy with parliamentary debates and centuries-old institutions. Different system, same math. After World War II, Britain emerged technically victorious and financially broken. The empire was unraveling, the pound was under huge pressure, and the government faced a classic dilemma: defend the currency or defend living standards. This is Stage 1 again. A currency in trouble and a state desperate to maintain credibility. In 1966, the Exchange Control Act took aim at gold. Private ownership of gold bullion and certain coins was heavily restricted or outright banned. Gold wasn't rounded up with soldiers, it was suffocated with paperwork and regulation. That's Stage 2, in a softer accent. It's no longer a crime of treason, but it is a violation of financial law. Citizens were required to sell excess gold to the Bank of England, or authorized dealers at prices the authorities controlled. The government presented this as defending the pound and protecting the economy. In reality, it weakened every saver who wanted an escape route. When Britain eventually devalued the pound in 1967, cutting its value overnight, those stuck in the currency took the hit. Gold, meanwhile, marched higher over the next decade. By 1980, it had exploded from $35 to hundreds of dollars per ounce. British citizens who had been locked out of owning gold for years missed one of the greatest precious metal bull runs in history. The 4 stages had played out again, not through confiscation raids, but through prohibition, restriction, and delayed access. France used a more fragmented, but equally effective, version of the same script. Through the 20th century, especially in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1950s, France cycled through repeated fiscal crises, war damage, political instability, budget deficits. Stage 1. To stabilize the system, authorities leaned on the banking network. Citizens were encouraged or required to deposit their gold in banks for safety or for the national interest. Over time, those deposits were converted into francs at rates set not by open markets, but by law. That's Stages 2 and 3 blended together. Ownership doesn't disappear, but it becomes mediated by institutions aligned with the state. Eventually, the franc itself was devalued multiple times, 1928, 1936, 1958, eroding the purchasing power of anyone who held it. On paper, people still had money. In reality, that money bought less and less. Again, those who had surrendered their gold were trapped in a melting currency. Those who hadn't fared better. Australia followed with its own version. In 1959, under the Banking Act, Australia effectively banned private ownership of most forms of gold without special permission. The justification? Post-war reconstruction, financial stability, and the needs of the nation. Stage 1. The law said that if you discovered gold or imported it, the Reserve Bank of Australia had first claim. Citizens had to sell to authorised dealers at controlled prices. Stage 3 in action, framed as orderly markets. The ban lasted for 17 years, until 1976. During much of that time, the global price of gold was climbing from the old $35 peg into triple digits. Australians were technically part of the same global economy, but blocked from easy participation in one of the most powerful wealth protection booms of that era. The opportunity cost was a quiet, invisible confiscation. India's story is even longer. In the early 1960s, the country faced a balance of payments crisis. Too many imports, not enough foreign currency, persistent deficits. Gold, deeply embedded in Indian culture as a store of family wealth, became a target. The Gold Control Act restricted how much gold ordinary people could legally hold. Jewelers were squeezed. Private hoards had to be declared. Anything beyond tightly defined limits became illegal. That was stage 2 in a particularly personal form. The gold that represented dowries, family security, and generational savings was suddenly suspect. Over the next decades, the rupee was devalued multiple times. Those who had been forced out of gold and into currency watched their purchasing power evaporate slowly, year after year. Ironically, once those restrictions were lifted around 1990, India blossomed into one of the largest gold-consuming nations in the world. The cultural instinct to protect wealth with metal had never gone away, only been suppressed. Italy's path ran through empire and collapse. In the 1930s, Mussolini needed resources to invade Ethiopia and later to support the Axis war effort. Stage 1. War ambitions plus weak finances. The regime launched propaganda campaigns like Gold for the Fatherland, encouraging families to donate their gold wedding rings and heirlooms in exchange for bonds or symbolic iron rings. Underneath the patriotic slogans was the same mechanism, Stage 3. A trade of something real for something the government could inflate or default on. Eventually, those bonds became nearly worthless. After World War II, the lira collapsed under inflation and reconstruction. Citizens who had handed over gold in the name of national pride found themselves holding promises in a broken currency. Japan, too, turned inward for resources during World War II. As the empire expanded and costs soared, the government ordered citizens to surrender gold for yen at official rates. Stage 2. Compulsory surrender wrapped in wartime rhetoric. Stage 3. Controlled prices favoring the state. After defeat, Japan experienced severe inflation. By 1946, prices were dozens of times higher than just a few years earlier. The yen was shattered. People who had swapped their gold for paper saw their savings destroyed. Those few who hid coins or bars, illegally, often preserved a chunk of purchasing power that their law-abiding neighbors lost. Across all of these stories, United States, Germany, Britain, France, Australia, India, Italy, Japan, the surface details change. Dictators versus democracies, war versus peace, open confiscation versus quiet prohibition. But underneath, the same skeleton repeats. Stage 1, crisis. Stage 2, criminalize or restrict ownership. Stage 3, force people into a bad deal. Stage 4, revalue the metal or debase the currency in a way that quietly transfers wealth upward. It worked over and over across 5 decades, and in every one of those cases, the people who came out the other side with their wealth intact had 2 things in common. They recognized the pattern early, and they kept part of their savings outside the official banking system. Those who trusted that the government will sort it out and stayed fully inside the system paid the price. Sometimes slowly through inflation, sometimes suddenly through devaluation, sometimes both. That's the past. But the uncomfortable truth of this story is that the pattern doesn't live in the 1930s or in yellowed photos from World War II. It lives in numbers that are flashing right now, in debt levels, currency pressures, capital flight, military spending, and bank fragility. The same 5 triggers that appeared before those 8 confiscations. They're lighting up again. If you strip away the flags, speeches, and slogans, all 8 historical confiscations share something deeper in common. They weren't random. They appeared only after a specific set of conditions had formed, a kind of pressure gauge that, once it crossed a certain line, pushed governments toward the same solution. When you line up the cases side by side, United States, Germany, Britain, France, Australia, India, Italy, Japan, you see the same 5 triggers over and over again. Unsustainable government debt, a currency under pressure, capital trying to escape, war or heavy military spending, and instability in the banking system. Not every trigger appears in every country, but most do. And critically, you almost never see a full-blown confiscation without at least several of them flashing red at the same time. In 7 out of 8 cases, government debt was already a structural problem. Politicians had promised too much, spent too much, or fought wars they couldn't truly afford. Taxes were maxed out politically. Cutting spending risked unrest or collapse. That's the first trigger, when the math stops working, and the only way to keep the machine running is to quietly change how money itself works. The second trigger is a currency under pressure. You see it in Germany's pre-Nazi hyperinflation, in Britain's struggling pound, in France's repeated devaluations, in Italy and Japan after devastating wars. When people begin losing confidence in the national currency, when they suspect that what sits in their bank account today will buy less tomorrow, they start doing what humans have always done. They look for the exits. That leads straight to the third trigger: capital flight. Sometimes it is literally money leaving the country. Wealthy citizens wiring funds abroad, buying foreign property, holding offshore accounts. Sometimes it's more subtle. People moving into gold and silver, hoarding coins and jewelry, hiding anything that can't be devalued with a pen stroke. Governments notice this, and once they see capital running for the doors, they start asking, how do we close those doors? The fourth trigger is war or heavy military spending. It doesn't have to be tanks rolling across borders. Sometimes it's long, grinding campaigns abroad or massive defense commitments that stretch across decades. War is expensive in the most literal sense. It doesn't just cost lives, it costs steel, oil, ammunition, salaries, logistics. Historically, when governments face war with a stretched balance sheet, they reach for whatever resources remain inside the borders. Not just land and factories, but private savings, especially in hard assets like gold. The fifth trigger is banking instability. When banks start failing, or when there is even a realistic fear they might, trust in the financial system evaporates. People pull deposits, demand cash, and if they can, switch from cash to metal. That combination, failing banks and rising demand for gold, is exactly what we saw in the late stages before several historical confiscations. It creates a perfect justification. To save the banking system, we must temporarily control or restrict gold. Temporarily, of course, often lasts years or decades. Put these 5 triggers together, and you get a grim equation. Too much debt to ever repay honestly, a currency losing credibility, smart money seeking protection, a state under military or geopolitical pressure, and banks that can't survive a full-blown loss of confidence. In theory, governments have choices. They can default openly, they can cut spending brutally, they can raise taxes to levels that spark revolt. In practice, they usually reach for a fourth option: restructure the system itself so that the pain is hidden, spread out, and hardest to see until long after it has happened. That's where confiscation and inflation come in. Now look at where we stand in 2025. US national debt has surged to around $36 trillion, roughly 129% of GDP. Projections show it heading toward $50 trillion by 2034, close to 180% of GDP, with annual interest payments crossing into the trillions. That's not a normal budget problem, that is structural overload. It means more and more tax revenue, just to service yesterday's spending, leaving less and less for today, and making future promises mathematically impossible without changing the rules of the game. That's the first trigger. Unsustainable debt, now flashing brighter than it was even in 1933. Back then, US debt to GDP was roughly 40%. Today, it's more than triple that. The second trigger, currency stress, is just as visible. The petrodollar system, born in the 1970s, when oil was priced almost exclusively in US dollars, quietly shifted in 2024, when Saudi Arabia let the old oil for dollars understanding fade. Major economies are exploring or actively building alternative payment systems that reduce reliance on the dollar. At the same time, central banks around the world have been buying gold by the hundreds of tons, diversifying out of US Treasury holdings and other dollar assets. That is not a rebellion, it is a rebalancing. But it sends a clear message. The world is slowly, steadily hedging against the dollar's future. That's what currency under pressure looks like in the 21st century. Not a sudden collapse, but a gradual decision by large players to hold less of it and more of something else. The third trigger, capital flight, is emerging in quieter ways. Wealthy individuals move funds offshore. Some renounce citizenship entirely. Others shift savings from bank deposits into physical gold, silver, and other hard assets. Dealers talk about shortages and premiums above the quoted spot price, suggesting that real-world demand is outpacing the neat numbers on a trading screen. Middle-class savers, too, are uneasy. They remember 2008, they saw 2020's money printing, and they are living through the cost of that liquidity in their grocery bills and rent. Each of these behaviors, offshore moves, physical metal buying, diversification, are early signs of capital trying to slip through the cracks before the doors fully close. The fourth trigger, military spending, is now a permanent feature of the landscape. Official US defense budgets hover in the high hundreds of billions. But once you add veterans' benefits, nuclear weapons programs, intelligence agencies, and related security spending, the true annual bill is well over $1.5 trillion. On top of that comes supplemental packages for proxy conflicts and foreign aid tied to defense. This is not a short, sharp war. It's a long, structural commitment to global military presence. Historically, that kind of open-ended cost, combined with high debt, tends to be paid for with one quiet tool: monetary expansion. Then comes the fifth trigger: banking instability. In March 2023, several U.S. regional banks, Silicon Valley Bank, Signature, First Republic, collapsed in quick succession. The immediate panic was contained, but the deeper problem didn't disappear. Regional banks still carry huge exposures to commercial real estate, with hundreds of billions in loans maturing between 2024 and 2026. Many of those properties are worth less today than when the loans were made. If enough borrowers can't refinance and enough properties fall in value, the pressure rebounds onto bank balance sheets. You don't need thousands of failures to spark a crisis, just enough that people start wondering whether their deposits are truly safe. That's how a technical problem becomes an emotional one. Overlay all five triggers: debt, currency stress, capital flight, war spending, bank risk, and then look at what gold and silver have done. Gold trades around $4,200 per ounce, up roughly 59% in 12 months. Silver sits in the 60-64 range, up about 86 and 96% in the same period. These are not normal moves for the boring metals everyone likes to ignore during good times. When both metals explode upward together, it usually means something fundamental is shifting in how markets see the future of money. Historically, spikes like this have coincided with moments of deep anxiety about inflation, debt sustainability, and the stability of the financial system itself. Late 1970s, gold rockets from roughly $220 to $850 as inflation runs wild and trust in paper money erodes. Early 1970s, gold doubles from $35 to $70 after the US breaks the last tie between the dollar and gold, then keeps climbing as people realize the rules have changed. In the 1930s, confiscation meant paper notices on bank doors and laws that literally outlawed coins. In the 2020s, it won't look like that. Today, gold and silver live in a different world. Online brokers, ETFs, offshore vaults, tokenized metals, derivatives. Physical confiscation, house by house, is slow, messy, and politically explosive. So the strategy has evolved. The goal is the same: to trap wealth inside the system so it can be inflated away. But the tools are digital, quiet, and far easier to sell as modernization and financial stability. Think less of soldiers seizing coins and more of code quietly declining a transaction. The first modern mechanism is punitive taxation and total visibility. In many countries, gold is already treated differently from other assets. Higher capital gains rates, complicated reporting rules, and limited tax advantages compared to stocks or bonds. That's the starting point, not the end game. In a genuine crisis, the tax code becomes a weapon. Governments don't need to outlaw gold. They can make holding it so expensive that only a tiny minority can afford to keep it. Imagine capital gains taxes on precious metals suddenly jumping from 28% to 50% or even 70%. Imagine new annual mark-to-market wealth taxes on metal holdings justified as asking everyone to contribute. Imagine mandatory registration of all physical gold and silver above a small exemption, linked directly to your tax ID, with automatic data sharing to the revenue agency. On paper, your metal is still yours. In practice, every ounce becomes a beacon the state can tax, track, or, in a future emergency, temporarily levy extraordinary contributions on. The effect is almost identical to confiscation. The economic benefit of owning gold gets squeezed until most people quietly exit. The second mechanism is central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. These are digital versions of national currencies issued directly by central banks. They are often sold as an upgrade, a cleaner, faster, more inclusive way to pay. But under the surface, they come with something cash never had: programmability. A digital dollar or euro can, in theory, be coded with rules. Rules about where it can be spent, when it expires, what it can buy, and, crucially, what it cannot buy. If your savings live inside a CBDC wallet and the government decides that buying physical gold or silver is destabilizing, the system doesn't need to pass a law sending police to your house. It can simply decline the transaction. Payment refused, asset not permitted. Or it can allow the transaction, but automatically apply a 90% stability tax on any purchase of precious metals. Or it can flag your account for review if you attempt to buy above a certain threshold. Outwardly, the language will be technocratic. Anti-money laundering, combating terror financing, preventing speculation, stabilizing markets. But the effect is painfully simple. The path from your digital money to real metal narrows, then closes. The third mechanism is capital controls. These already exist in various forms around the world. In crises, governments limit how much cash you can withdraw, how much money you can wire abroad, what currencies you can buy, and sometimes what kinds of assets you're allowed to convert into. When we talk about capital controls, we tend to picture distressed economies like Argentina, Greece, or Cyprus, where people lined up at ATMs only to discover their withdrawal limits had been slashed. But the same logic can be applied in more subtle ways in larger economies. In a dollar or euro crisis, authorities could set daily limits on bank withdrawals to prevent bank runs. They could restrict international transfers to stop speculative attacks on the currency. And they could quietly classify large gold and silver purchases as non-essential outflows, subject to special approval or outright bans. You still see a number in your account, but the path from that number to anything that might protect you, foreign currency, offshore assets, physical metal, is fenced off with regulations, red tape, and waiting periods that suddenly become infinite. The fourth mechanism is bail-ins. Most people still think in terms of bailouts, governments using taxpayer money to rescue banks. But in the wake of the 2008 crisis, a different model took shape in many jurisdictions: bail-ins, where the bank rescues itself by using your deposits. Under bail-in rules, if a bank is failing, it can convert part of your deposits into bank shares or simply write them down, turning your supposedly safe cash into risk capital. You don't get a say. You wake up one morning and find that a large slice of your savings has been used to plug a hole on the bank assess balance sheet. In a world where bail-ins are accepted policy, you don't need to confiscate gold directly. You just need a banking crisis severe enough that depositors lose a significant fraction of their money before they ever get the chance to move into hard assets. The trap is set long before anyone lines up at a bullion dealer. Look at the four mechanisms together: aggressive taxation on gold and silver, programmable digital money, capital controls, and bail-ins. None of them require a government agent to step into your living room. All of them are implemented through systems you already use: tax filings, banking apps, digital wallets, brokerage accounts. They are sold as innovations, reforms, safety nets. But in a stress scenario, they align into a single structure, a closed loop where your wealth circulates inside official channels and cannot easily reach assets that sit outside the system. The result is functionally identical to the 1933 confiscation, but much easier to hide behind technocratic language. You don't see gold confiscation in a headline. You see emergency transaction restrictions, temporary stability measures, digital currency upgrades, extraordinary contribution from asset holders. The 4 historical stages are still there, just wearing new clothes. Stage 1. Crisis. This time driven by ballooning debt, slowing growth, currency shifts, and structural deficits. Stage 2. Criminalize or restrict alternatives. Only now it's not a simple ban on coins, but a mesh of regulations, digital controls, and reporting that make moving into gold feel risky, expensive, or outright impossible. Stage 3. Trap wealth in paper, your savings held as digital currency and bank deposits that can easily escape into hard assets before the next shock hits. Stage 4. Devalue, through inflation, fiscal repression, negative real interest rates, and potential repricing of gold at a much higher official level that benefits those holding it inside state reserves, not ordinary citizens. The mechanism is evolving, but the direction of the wealth transfer is exactly the same. From individuals trying to protect themselves to a system trying to survive its own promises. The unsettling part is that this isn't speculation from a dystopian novel. Pieces of this architecture already exist. CBDC pilots are being rolled out. Bail-in frameworks are written into law. Capital controls have been tested in Europe, Latin America, and beyond. Gold and silver are already taxed at higher rates than many financial assets. Each tool, on its own, can be defended. Together, they quietly reconstruct the same 4-step pattern we've seen 8 times in a century. And because it's digital, it can be activated much faster than a presidential order typed on paper and nailed to a bank door. You may not get 26 days notice this time. You may get a push notification. In the next part, we'll tie this mechanism to a concrete timeline. How the years between now and the early 2030s could unfold if history rhymes again, the likely sequence of crises, the moment when restrictions become necessary, and the point at which the revaluation happens and most people realize, too late, that the pattern already finished its work.